In the spring of 1918, on a rain-soaked outpost in the Argonne forest of France, a 25-year-old former Albany Railroad porter named Henry Johnson fought off more than 20 enemy soldiers alone, first with a rifle, then with hand projectiles, and finally, when his supply ran out entirely, with nothing but a bolo knife, defending a wounded comrade until Allied reinforcements finally arrived. The French army awarded him their nation's highest military honor within days. His own country, the one he had volunteered to serve, would take nearly a century to formally recognize what he had done that night. That single, profound contradiction, extraordinary valor abroad, met with indifference and open hostility at home, defines almost everything you need to understand about the 369th Infantry Regiment, the men history would come to know as the Harlem Hellfighters. This is their story. 191 days of continuous engagement, more than any other American regiment in the entire conflict, a unit that never lost a foot of ground and never had a single soldier taken captive, and a homecoming that revealed, with painful clarity, exactly how little that sacrifice would change the country these men returned to. To understand the 369th, you first have to understand the peculiar and deeply unjust position African American soldiers occupied within the United States military as the country entered the global struggle in April of 1917. The regiment itself began as the 15th New York National Guard, authorized in 1913 as the first African American regiment within New York State's Guard, and its ranks were filled with men from across New York State, alongside a meaningful number of volunteers from Puerto Rico. From the very beginning, the men who joined this unit did so fully aware they were volunteering to serve a country that in vast stretches of its own territory denied them basic civil rights, equal protection under the law, and in many cases, physical safety. That contradiction became painfully literal almost immediately. In the fall of 1917, the regiment was sent to Camp Wadsworth in Spartanburg, South Carolina, for training alongside other American units preparing for deployment. What they encountered there was not merely discomfort or unfamiliarity, but active, dangerous hostility from local residents, who objected furiously to the presence of armed black soldiers in their town, regardless of the uniform those soldiers wore or the country they were preparing to defend. Tensions escalated to the point of real physical danger for the regiment's soldiers, and military officials, rather than confronting the discrimination directly, made the decision to relocate the entire regiment. In November of 1917, the 15th New York shipped out for France earlier than originally planned, a decision driven at least in part by the simple recognition that Spartanburg had become too dangerous a place for these men to continue training. Arriving in France, the regiment encountered yet another form of institutional discrimination, one baked into the very structure of the American Expeditionary Forces. General John J. Pershing's command, reflecting the broader racial policies of the American military at the time, initially assigned the newly designated 369th Infantry Regiment, not to front-line duty, but to labor battalions, building roads, unloading supply ships, and performing manual construction work far from the front lines, precisely the kind of assignment given to the overwhelming majority of African American units throughout the conflict, regardless of their training, ability, or willingness to fight. For men who had volunteered specifically to serve their country in active duty, the assignment represented a demoralizing continuation of exactly the pattern of dismissal and diminishment they had already experienced at home. What changed the regiment's fate was, in a genuinely striking historical irony, a decision driven by American racial policy itself, one that inadvertently opened the door to the very active duty opportunity the U.S. military had been determined to deny these men. Because Pershing's command remained unwilling to integrate the 369th into combat alongside white American units, and equally unwilling to continue justifying its use purely as unarmed labor, the regiment was instead loaned out entirely to the French army, placed under French command, equipped with French supplies and gear, and folded into a French infantry division as though the men were French colonial troops rather than members of the American military at all. It's a decision that reveals, with uncomfortable clarity, just how deeply race shaped even the basic tactical decisions of America's war effort. A unit good enough, apparently, to serve and risk their lives for an ally's army, but not to serve alongside the very countrymen who had sent them overseas in the first place. For the men of the 369th, however, the reassignment to French command proved to be the opportunity they had been seeking all along. The French army, considerably less concerned with the racial anxieties that had shaped American policy, integrated the regiment directly into frontline duty, and the 369th entered the defensive positions in the Champagne region of France in the spring of 1918, beginning a deployment that would ultimately stretch across an unmatched 191 continuous days on the front lines, longer than any other American regiment would serve in the entire conflict. It was during this period, in the early hours of May 14, 1918, that Henry Johnson's extraordinary stand took place, an episode that would become perhaps the single most famous moment in the regiment's entire service history. Johnson and a fellow soldier, Private Needham Roberts, were manning an isolated forward outpost when an opposing raiding party, estimated at 24 or more soldiers, launched a surprise nighttime assault. Roberts was severely injured early in the engagement, and Johnson, determined not to let his comrade be taken captive, fought on essentially alone, throwing hand explosives until his supply was exhausted, firing his rifle until it jammed, and then using it as a defensive club, and finally, when an opposing soldier attempted to drag the injured Roberts away as a captive, driving him back with a bolo knife in intense close-quarters action. When French reinforcements arrived at dawn, they found evidence suggesting Johnson had neutralized as many as 4 opposing soldiers and repelled numerous others, despite sustaining 21 injuries himself during the encounter. The engagement became known, both in French and later American press, as the Battle of Henry Johnson, and within days, both Johnson and Roberts became the first Americans of the entire conflict, of any background, to receive France's Croix de Guerre, awarded specifically for extraordinary acts of heroism in active service. Johnson received the added distinction of the Croix de Guerre avec Palme, a still higher tier of the honor reserved for the most exceptional acts of valor, and American newspapers, in the sensationalized language typical of the era, took to calling him Black Death, a moniker that, however crudely framed, reflected genuine and widespread astonishment at what he had accomplished. This regiment, remember, is proudly bringing to light the stories of soldiers whose sacrifice went largely unrecognized for far too long. And if you value seeing that history told honestly and in full, subscribing genuinely helps us continue doing exactly that kind of work. Johnson's individual heroism, remarkable as it was, represented only the opening chapter of a service record that would ultimately span some of the era's most significant engagements. The 369th served at Château Thierry, and in the dense, intense environment of Belleau Wood, participated in the Second Battle of the Marne, as Allied forces turned back the opposing military's last major offensive, and later took part in the massive Meuse-Argonne offensive, the largest and most intense American operation of the entire struggle. During the Argonne operations in September of 1918, the regiment captured the French town of Ripon within a single day of engagement and continued pushing opposing forces back across the following month of sustained operations. Colonel William Hayward, the regiment's commanding officer, a white officer who had actively fought against attempts to keep his men confined to labor duty and who had personally lobbied for the regiment's active deployment, described his soldiers' operational philosophy in terms that became something close to the unit's unofficial motto. His men, he said, did not retreat. They went forward, or they fell. Whatever one makes of the stark bluntness of that framing, the regiment's actual record bore it out with remarkable consistency. Across the entirety of their 191 days under fire, the 369th never surrendered a single foot of previously captured ground to opposing forces, and remarkably, no soldier from the regiment was ever successfully taken and held as a prisoner, a distinction essentially unmatched among American units of the entire conflict. On the rare occasions individual soldiers were briefly isolated during the chaos of action, the regiment's own counter-moves recovered them, refusing to accept the loss even temporarily. Historical accounts note only a single instance across the entire deployment where the regiment failed to achieve an assigned operational objective, an outcome attributed largely to inadequate artillery support rather than any failure of the infantry itself. This sustained operational effectiveness came at an enormous human cost. Across their time at the front, the 369th suffered approximately 1,500 total casualties among their ranks, among the highest losses recorded by any single American regiment throughout the entire conflict, a striking statistic that speaks both to the intensity of the operational environment these men endured and to the sheer duration of their unmatched time on the front lines. In recognition of this sustained valor, the French military command awarded the entire regiment its Croix de Guerre collectively on December 13, 1918, a formal citation honoring the unit as a whole for its conduct at the Meuse-Argonne, complete with a silver star embroidered directly onto the regimental colors. More than 170 individual officers and soldiers within the regiment received additional medals and commendations for specific acts of bravery, an extraordinary concentration of decorated valor within a single unit, and opposing forces who had faced the regiment in action reportedly gave them the nickname that would follow them through history: Hellfighters, a term of grudging respect from an opponent that had clearly not anticipated the determination these men would bring to the field. Beyond the front lines themselves, the 369th left another, considerably less hostile, but genuinely lasting mark on European culture during their time in France. The regiment's band, led by Lieutenant James Reese Europe, an accomplished band leader and composer from New York, introduced early jazz music to European audiences on a scale that had never happened before, touring hospitals, military camps, and eventually performing in Paris itself at the invitation of American headquarters. Contemporary accounts describe crowds numbering in the tens of thousands, gathering to hear the band's performances of ragtime and blues-inflected music, largely unfamiliar to European ears at the time, a cultural introduction that historians now recognize as a genuinely significant early chapter in jazz's spread beyond American shores, achieved notably by the same regiment, simultaneously earning a reputation as one of the most formidable units on the entire Western Front. When the conflict finally ended in November of 1918, the 369th could rightfully claim one of the most distinguished service records of any American unit, a regiment that had spent longer under continuous deployment than any other, that had never lost ground, never surrendered a prisoner, and had been honored collectively by an allied nation's highest military distinction. And yet the homecoming these men received, and the country they returned to, told a considerably darker and more complicated story about exactly how much that sacrifice would actually change. On February 17, 1919, New York City staged an enormous victory parade up Fifth Avenue specifically to welcome the 369th home, and by most contemporary accounts, it was a genuinely massive and enthusiastic public celebration, with crowds lining the parade route to cheer the regiment's return. It's worth pausing on this moment because it represents something real, a city, at least for that single afternoon, willing to publicly honor and celebrate the extraordinary valor these men had demonstrated overseas. But that celebration, however genuine, existed within a country that had not fundamentally altered the systemic inequalities these soldiers had left behind when they shipped out. And in many respects, the months immediately following their return would prove that painfully clear. The summer of 1919 became known, grimly, as the Red Summer, a period during which civil unrest and racial violence erupted in dozens of American cities, driven substantially by systemic resentment and anxiety over returning black veterans, men who had served their country with distinction and who, in many cases, returned home with a heightened and entirely justified expectation of equal treatment and basic civil rights. That expectation collided directly with an entrenched system of segregation, disenfranchisement, and, in the most severe cases, mob violence that showed little sign of yielding simply because black soldiers had proven their loyalty and capability on a foreign field. Henry Johnson himself, despite his internationally recognized heroism, returned to a country that offered him no formal American military honor whatsoever for his actions that night in the Argonne, no Purple Heart, despite his 21 injuries, and a civilian life that grew increasingly difficult, marked by physical disability from his injuries, and by a country largely uninterested in translating its momentary parade day enthusiasm into any lasting material recognition or support. Johnson passed away in 1929 in relative poverty and obscurity, having received during his lifetime essentially none of the formal recognition from his own country that his actions had so clearly earned. It would take an extraordinary length of time for that injustice to begin, even partially to be corrected. Henry Johnson was posthumously awarded the Purple Heart in 1996, 67 years after his passing. In 2003, he received the Distinguished Service Cross. And finally, in 2015, President Barack Obama presented Henry Johnson with the Medal of Honor, the United States military's highest decoration, awarded posthumously, nearly a full century after the actions that had earned it, and only after decades of advocacy by historians, veterans organizations, and members of Congress determined that this particular injustice would not simply be allowed to fade quietly into history. In 2020, the U.S. Army formally approved an official special designation recognizing the unit's own hard-won nickname, the Harlem Hellfighters, a belated but meaningful institutional acknowledgement of exactly what these men had accomplished and exactly what they had been called by those who faced them in combat. Today, 169 members of the 369th Infantry Regiment rest in American Battle Monuments Commission cemeteries across France, the overwhelming majority of them at the Meuse-Argonne American Cemetery, alongside more than 14,000 other American service members who never returned home from the war. Their graves stand as a permanent, physical testament to a genuinely uncomfortable historical truth: that some of the most valorous, effective, and sustained performance of any American unit in the entirety of World War I was delivered by men who had to fight for the right to serve at all, who were equipped and commanded by an ally's military because their own country's leadership doubted their fitness for duty, and who returned from that extraordinary service to a homeland that took, in Henry Johnson's case alone, nearly 100 years to formally say thank you. The story of the Harlem Hellfighters resists easy resolution, and that resistance is, in its own way, exactly the point. It is a story of genuine, extraordinary heroism, 191 days of unbroken deployment, a collective croix de guerre, more than 170 individual medals, and a reputation earned directly on the field of honor. It is simultaneously a story of a nation that placed extraordinary barriers in front of these men before they ever reached a deployment zone, and that offered painfully little in the way of recognition or lasting change once they returned home. Both of these truths sit together uneasily at the center of this regiment's legacy, and both deserve to be remembered with equal clarity, not softened into a simpler, more comfortable narrative than the actual historical record supports. If this story moved you, or if you learned something here you hadn't known before, share this video with someone who'd want to understand the full truth of what these men accomplished and what it cost them to accomplish it.